And we are recording today. So welcome everyone. I'm Lindsay Randall, and today we are excited. MAPC, the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, and the Massachusetts Historical Commission and Preservation Mass are excited to welcome all of you to the Eastern Massachusetts Historical Commission Coalition meeting, Telling a More Complete Story. We also want to take this moment to announce that the 19th Annual Mass History Conference, History is for Everyone, will be held on June 4th. This conference, I'm just getting the link. This conference shares our focus on inclusivity in historic narratives, and registration is still open. And I will put that in the chat for everyone too, just in case you haven't heard of the conference. And as stewards of history, understanding our past is crucial for effectively supporting and guiding equitable community development. And this knowledge empowers us to address contemporary challenges and create more welcoming and inclusive environments for our current, new, and future residents. And so today we are joined by Dr. Kabria Baumgartner, Dr. Donna Seger, and Ken Turino. And Dr. Kabria Baumgartner is a professor at Northeastern University, along with Jordy Minning, Senior Project Manager for the City of Newburyport, and Cy Rashke, a community member, co-founded the Newburyport Black History Initiative, a city community project that aims to highlight and incorporate Newburyport's Black history into the public landscape. And at the core of the project is the development, design, and installation of 10 interpretive signs in Newburyport's historic district. In addition to discussing her role as a co-founder and co-curator on this project, she will share some insights on how city planners, museum specialists, librarians, archivists, and community members can collaborate with academic historians and universities to reimagine Black history and the histories of people of color in New England's public landscape. Dr. Donna Seger, a professor at Salem State University, will discuss today Salem Centuries Project for Salem's Quadricentennial, and she aims to broaden Salem's historical narratives, which have long been overshadowed by the Salem witch trials, and often historically inaccurate history about the Salem witch trials, by incorporating perspectives of Indigenous peoples and enslaved Africans and revisiting events like the Revolutionary and Civil Wars. And this approach intends to offer a more layered and comprehensive view of Salem's rich history. And finally, Ken Turino from Historic New England will explore integrating LGBTQ+ history into local historic frameworks, offering insights on effectively recognizing and including these essential narratives. So during our presentations, if you have comments or questions, please put them in the chat. And at the end of all three presentations, we'll have time for Q&A. And yes, the meeting and the presentations are being recorded and will be posted to the MAPC YouTube page and posted to the EMHCC page on the MAPC website. I know that was a lot of acronyms, so feel free to ask me where the links are for any of that. So our first speaker today is Dr. Kabria Baumgartner, and she is the Dean's Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies at Northeastern University in Boston. She is the author of the award-winning book In Pursuit of Knowledge, Black Women in Educational Activism in Antebellum America. And as a community engaged public historian, she co-founded the Newburyport Black History Initiative. Sorry, just lost my reading. An organization that aims to highlight and incorporate Black history into the public landscape in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And she has also written the annotated guide, African Americans in Essex County, Massachusetts. And I will put the links to both of those in the chat in a moment. So Kabria, I will turn it over to you.
All right, sounds good. All right, thank you, Lindsay, for that introduction. And good morning to all of you. Can everyone hear me and see the PowerPoint just fine? Okay, great. So I am delighted to participate in this conversation, especially with my co-panelists whose work I'm very familiar with and also very much in awe of. And I want to share with you some of the collaborative work that I've been doing with the Newburyport Black History Initiative. And so in this presentation, I'm going to refer to that as NBHI, so Newburyport Black History Initiative. So in many ways, Newburyport is a quintessential New England seaport city. It's located about 35 miles north of Boston. I always say 35 miles, but it could take up to 2 hours depending on traffic. But I call Newburyport home. I've lived here for about 7 years. And I'm always very much appreciative of the history of the city. Federal style buildings and museums and statues, like the one pictured here of William Lloyd Garrison, mark the 750-acre downtown historic district, making it one of the largest National Register historic districts in Massachusetts. So Newburyport welcomes thousands of tourists annually, and the season has just begun here. And these tourists often learn about the city's history, from Garrison's activism to early maritime trade. This history also includes African Americans and other people of color who shaped the city and the region. But most tourists and even residents do not know that history, and they don't often get a chance to learn that history. In fact, many sites associated with the historical experiences of African Americans in Newburyport have been lost to fire, to highway development, urban renewal, or even just neglect. So in Newburyport, there have been some conversations over the years about the role of Black residents and the role that they played in the community's development in past centuries. And remarkably, some of those stories, though buried, still survive. And my academic research has always been concerned with unearthing these histories, these stories, and bringing them more clearly into view. So in April 2021, I was invited to give the keynote lecture at the 11th annual YWCA luncheon in Newburyport. And my lecture really focused on my research, which is about African American communities in 19th century New England. My first book focused specifically on African American women and children and the fight for education. And so I presented some of that research in this talk, and I also posed the following question: how can sharing the histories of marginalized groups help us build more inclusive and equitable communities today? And so I spoke about not just my academic research, but some of my collaborative projects with the National Park Service, specifically the Salem Maritime Site, and other organizations in Essex County, such as the Essex National Heritage Area. I pointed out to the audience there that we're all connected to Black history and Newburyport's Black heritage. It's everyone's history. So Sid Rashke was one of the audience members at that luncheon, and she reached out to me, and she was inspired and motivated. And she asked me, what's the next step in your research? The lecture was great. Your book is wonderful, but how do we share this work with even more people? And it's not often that academics are asked that question, and it's certainly a valid one. So she had an idea that she wanted to install or think about installing a sign in honor of the early Black Newburyport residents in the city. And she wanted that to be in the downtown area. And so she put me in touch with Jordy Vining, who's a senior project manager for the city of Newburyport. And Jordy had already designed and installed signs in Newburyport's historic district. So there were signs, and still are signs, on Irish immigrant workers, other signs on the Revolution. So he has decades of experience leading similar projects. So we all joined a Zoom call, and a few months later, the Newburyport Black History Initiative had begun. Formally launched in February 2022, NBHI includes Jordy Vining, Sid Rashke, and me. And we all share a deep interest in Black history, Black culture, and our work builds on and expands previous research from local historians. We're digging even deeper into local and regional archives. we are incorporating the most recent historiography, which I think is really quite important. And we're engaging in a kind of public writing that really educates and inspires and hopefully brings about racial justice. So our aim is really to ensure that the stories of Newburyport's early Black residents, businesses, and neighborhoods are made accessible and known to the public. And we want to ensure that Black history becomes part of the broader community and part of the broader community's collective identity. And so NBHI is fulfilling this mission through one key project, and that is a series of historical interpretive signs. We are writing, designing, developing, and installing 11 permanent historical interpretive signs for the public to encounter in high traffic pedestrian areas in downtown Newburyport. Producing high quality interpretive signs that display Black history is really a challenge. It presents a lot of challenge, especially in terms of research. So anyone studying this period of history is inevitably engaged in a complex project of recovery and preservation. Recovery is not just a matter of stitching together stories from archival fragments, once forgotten or thought to be lost, but it also focuses on recovering from the real harm done to erase and remove African Americans from New England. And this is a point that was made so beautifully in a book called Disowning Slavery, where she talks about, Joanne Pope Mellish talks about this process. So we know that history, we know that happened, and that impacts how we relate to and interact with each other today. So sharing this history with the public means dislodging the myth of a free, white, abolitionist New England and expanding what we know about those who came before us. So a few key principles guide the stories that we tell in these signs, which cover historical periods from the Revolutionary era to the early 20th century. So here are the principles. The first, we center Black faces, Black voices, Black stories, and Black experiences. Second, we demonstrate the relevance of infusing history into local public conversations. We believe that representation matters, especially for those in the community who are of color. To see themselves reflected in the signs is particularly meaningful. And for others who've not stopped to think about community demographics before, right, this is an opportunity to do so. And third, we weave fascinating individual stories from the past to capture the richness and diversity of Black experiences. Now, each sign's text is about 375 words, and for each sign, we deploy a rigorous approach to historical research and writing, to interpretation, and to peer review, which I think is something that the Academy can offer these kinds of projects. So before drafting each sign, we embark upon months of careful archival research. We're combing through letters and photographs and petitions and other materials. We're also looking at historic data from census and birth records to death and marriage records. We consult the recent scholarship on that particular topic, from monographs to peer-reviewed journal articles. And then we take all of this material, primary and secondary sources, and we draft the text and layout of the sign. And we do that over multiple meetings. And then once we have what we think is a pretty good draft, we share that draft with a diverse group of 7 community members. And that's our version of peer review. Those community members include archivists, librarians, scholars, writers, and professionals. And so we discuss their feedback, we make changes, and then we send the draft to our editor, Rebecca Bernard, who is a professional editor. She works at the Peabody Essex Museum. She volunteers her time for this project. And then we're able to finalize the sign text and the layout with our graphic design team. And then the sign goes into production. So we've secured funding for this project through a grant provided by the Newburyport Community Preservation Committee. This is part of the Community Preservation Act. And there also some funding has been provided by Northeastern University, where I work. So in the next three slides, I'm going to show a few of our signs, but I also have a link at the end of this presentation, and I believe that a link was put in the chat, so you can see all of our signs and read them. So on the very first day of Black History Month in 2023, last year, we unveiled our first interpretive sign commemorating a once thriving Black neighborhood in 19th century Newburyport. This neighborhood, which was located between present-day Low and Auburn Street, was home to a vibrant Black community of mariners and laborers in the 18th and 19th century. And there's a bridge in this area, and it's called Guinea Bridge. And a lot of local Newburyport residents did not know why the bridge was named that. And this history offered an explanation for why that bridge was named Guinea Bridge, because this was home to African-American residents. And this particular sign highlights Black Election Day celebrations. I recognize a few of you on the call. You probably know that I have been talking a lot about Black Election Day celebrations throughout Essex County. And it was really nice to find that there was a celebration right here in Newburyport. Every spring in the early 19th century, Black residents hosted a jubilant, homegrown celebration where revelers feasted on cake and ale, fiddlers roused the crowd. Apparently there were acrobats. This was all reported in the local newspaper. And Black residents voted for their very own elected official. And so in the early 19th century, that person was a mariner by the name of James Douglas, and that's who they crowned as their king. So in a lot of ways, this sign presents another side, another view of an early African-American community in New England. Most of our signs are located in the city's downtown area, as I mentioned. And so the idea there is to intercept people who might not otherwise seek out a history lesson. The graphic layout of the signs addresses the varying audiences that we might attract. So we might get the sprinters, as they're called, those who might absorb only the title and main photo. There are also the strollers, those who might take in a couple of bolded sentences and other supporting images. And then there are the scholars, those who stop and read the sign in its entirety. So this sign sits adjacent to the in-street playground in downtown Newburyport, and it highlights the photo studios that operated on State and Pleasant Street in Newburyport. The photographs shown on this sign were part of a collection of glass plate images that were recovered from a basement on Liberty Street in 2003. Archivist Sharon Spieldiner shared this collection with us, and we decided to craft a sign about the meaning and significance of studio photography for African Americans. And one of the quotes that we use here is from Frederick Douglass, who was probably the most photographed man in the 19th century. This sign, which will be installed later this year at the Bartlett Mall, tells the story of African American children, their parents and allies, who pushed for equal school rights. There's a photo of Thurgood Marshall on the sign because he visited the synagogue in Newburyport in November of 1958. And he lectured on the wrongs of prejudice, but he actually struck an optimistic tone when discussing racial integration. He said, "Once a generation has gone to school together, worked together, and lived together, prejudice will largely disappear." And as we know, that prediction has not yet come to pass. Leaders and community members in Newburyport have expressed widespread support for our interpretive sign project and our organization. We've noticed that now there seems to be a collective expectation among civic and nonprofit organizations in the area to really integrate Black history through newsletters and research and tours and community conversations. It's really wonderful to see that. And in the last minute or so that I have, I just want to mention some of the media coverage because that's been important in sharing our work and hopefully reaching a broader audience. So we were able to be in touch with journalists at the Boston Globe, at our local newspaper, the Daily News, and the Town Common. We've also been in conversations with elected leaders, including State Representative Dawn Shand, who commented how much she loved the project because it fights an erasure of our collective memory. We've also had a chance to work with other organizations in the city, including the Friends of William Lloyd Garrison Committee. Every year they host an annual speaker series that certainly engages the city and residents. And last year in December, we worked with them to present a proclamation to our city council declaring the week of December 4th to December 10th as Human Rights and Anti-Oppression Education Week. That proclamation was passed by our city council. And so we hosted an array of events that week. And it was really, really wonderful. And we hope to do that again this year. So you might be asking, what is the story then of Black Newburyport? What is the story that we're telling in these signs? And through our interpretive sign project and a larger organization, we're showing that African Americans have been agents of their own freedom. They have strengthened the nation's democratic ideals, and they've defined and defended civil rights right here in New England, right here in Massachusetts, right here in Newburyport. And so by reaching multiple audiences from residents and visitors to people of color and youth and elders, we really hope to foster a more welcoming and inclusive community. Thank you for listening, and I welcome your questions, comments, and insights during our Q&A.
Thank you, Kabria, for that. That was wonderful. And it's so exciting to, I've only read about what you guys have been doing up in Newburyport, so it was really exciting to hear about it. We're going to now turn to Donna. So Dr. Donna Seger is a professor at Salem State University and specializes in medieval and early modern history. Her notable works include the Practical Renaissance, and she is working on a forthcoming collaborative project with Dr. Brad Austin titled Salem Centuries, New Perspectives on the History of an Old American City. And through her blog, Streets of Salem, which I'm going to put right into the chat, she shares engaging insights into historical narratives, bridging the gap between academia and the public sphere. So, Donna?
Great, thank you. Just let me put this right up. So hello, I am very, very happy to be here. Let me just get in proper
Yeah, take your time, no rush.
Okay. Okay, here we are. I have a Liberty Street here. Oh, excuse me.
Sorry.
Yeah.
We're not seeing your PowerPoint yet.
Oh, you're not?
No.
Oh, no. Okay.
We're seeing your home thing.
Not seeing it now?
Now we're seeing it, but it is not in presentation.
Okay. Okay. Seeing it now?
Perfect.
Okay, I need to go back though to my first slide.
Yes.
Okay. We all set?
Perfect. Excellent.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Hello, everyone. And I'm so happy to be here with my North Shore neighbors. I have a Liberty Street here too. This is an interesting picture from a chapbook published by Salem's Reverend Billy Cook, who was a poet and a graphic artist and not a reverend, even though he called himself that. And he would make these amazing productions and sell them house to house, and also give kind of poetry orations just on the streets of Salem, the inspiration for my blog. And Liberty Street is no longer with us. It is right where the Peabody Essex Museum Street sits, the museum addition sits right now. Before I get into my presentation, I just want to give you a heads up of where I'm coming from, because as you noticed from Lindsay's introduction, I'm not an American historian. So what am I doing here? I'm a tutor historian, actually. I teach medieval and early modern history at Salem State, but I am a longtime resident of Salem. I've lived here for 30 years. I think this is my 30th year in Salem. And like all of you, I was a volunteer. I am a volunteer. I think I've been on every board in Salem. Salem has lots of cultural institutions. And after I kind of got tenure and it could afford to dabble in other things, I started thinking about Salem history and asking questions about Salem history. And I could never really find an answer because Salem is kind of a unique city when it comes to our history. So before I get into some sort of general observations on how to do public history projects in Salem and elsewhere, which might provide some guidance for all of you, I just want to address what's unique about Salem because it can present some challenges. So I think the two unique aspects of Salem when it comes to its public history, and this might be surprising for people, but we actually have no resident professional historical society or historical museum in Salem. Okay, we have no one that is keeping and interpreting our history in Salem. Okay, this is kind of the result of a historical accident. The old Essex Institute, which was absorbed into the Peabody Essex Museum, I think by the fact that it was located in Salem from 1821 on, it became the de facto historical society for Salem. And when it was absorbed into the PEM, and even before that, it ceased operating that function, but Salem did not develop a historical society because of the Essex Institute. So with the withdrawal and absorption of the Essex Institute, Salem was ceased to be served by a functioning historical society or historical museum. At the same time, the other unique aspect of Salem is, of course, it is the witch city. And believe me, I have lived in Salem for 30 years, and I was one of the people that was out there in the crowd in 2005 protesting that damn statue. So, so I just want to lay that all out on the table. So as witch city, that identity, which is an old identity for Salem, you can, see references back in the 1870s, even the 1850s. It's a long identity, but of course it has been intensified over the last several decades. And the result of the withdrawal or absence of a historical society and the increasing identity and commercialization of Salem's history has resulted in kind of a challenging environment for the public-oriented historian who might be interested in all of Salem's history. We also have commodification. We have a heritage trail in Salem. It used to be called the Red Line. Now it's a yellow line, but it is not substantially different. The heritage trail was not created by by the Historical Commission or by a committee of concerned citizens or by academics or by the leaders of Salem's myriad heritage institutions. It was created by the city's tourism agency, Destination Salem. And it includes, both serious accredited museums like the Peabody Essex Museum, as well as for-profit non-accredited museums. There's really no distinction between the two. It is also just restricted to downtown and excludes a lot of Salem's cultural institutions like Hamilton Hall and the Salem Athenaeum and the Pickering House. So that's the world that we live in here in Salem. That's the world that the historian lives in Salem. And increasingly, there are people in Salem who want to tell a more complete story, to use the title of our forum. And they are doing it. But the other feature and characteristic of Salem's heritage environment is that we have so many different institutions. We have the Peabody Essex Museum, of course. We have Historic New England, which operates both the Phillips House on Chestnut Street as well as the 17th century Gedney House. We have a National Historic Maritime Site, Salem Maritime. We have the House of Seven Gables. We have the Salem Athenaeum. We have the Pickering House. We have Hamilton Hall. We have myriad institutions. And so there's kind of a decentralization of heritage in Salem. This can be an opportunity because you have multiple voices, but it's also a bit challenging. And I think as Salem has been approaching its quadricentennial in 2026. 2026 will be the 400th anniversary of European settlement in Salem. I think the whole process of getting ready for that big commemoration has exposed some of these challenges. There is a Salem 400 plus committee. It is confined to stakeholders. There have been no public hearings whatsoever. It seldom meets. There's one full-time coordinator, and that's pretty much it. And when I asked members of the Salem 400 Plus committee what was the role of the city of Salem, most of them had said to me, the role of the city of Salem in kind of shepherding this 400 plus commemoration is to curate and amplify. Okay. Not to offer up any programming, but to curate and amplify what these other institutions in Salem are offering up. So I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, it could be good, could be bad. I don't know. But that is the role that's happening now. Fortunately, the cultural institutions and heritage institutions that are in Salem are all engaged in processes of expanding their interpretation, widening their interpretation, diversifying their interpretation. And so I think they do offer a counterbalance to the more commodified history of Salem, which is very singularly focused on the Salem witch trials. And one example of that, and I'm just so thrilled to be on this panel with Kabria because I just love her book. For many years, I was president of the board of Hamilton Hall on Chestnut Street. This is a Samuel McIntyre assembly hall that was built in 1805. I have a general interest in this as a president of the board for many years, and also my house is right next door to it. So I have a very specific interest in Hamilton Hall as well. Hamilton Hall is such an interesting institution. It's still a functioning assembly hall, but for many years in the early and mid 19th century, it was the home of an amazing African-American family established by John and Nancy Remond. And the Remonds were incredible entrepreneurs and incredible abolitionist activists. They were activists in general. One thing that they were singularly focused on was the integration of Salem's public schools. And that's the story that Kabria tells in her wonderful book. Two of the children of Nancy and John Remond, and that's John right there over on the side, he's like my hero, became very well-known abolitionist orators, Sarah and Charles, but their entire family, they had 10 children, were always working for something in Salem. We have petitions in which they've all signed, men and women, protesting capital punishment. They were suffragists. They wanted not only the desegregation of education, but all the desegregation of transportation. So this is a vibrant African-American family right in the heart of Salem. And so at Hamilton Hall, we were able to really expand the story of our hall, just focusing on this one single family. And so I think what we did at Hamilton Hall has been kind of representative of what other institutions have been doing in Salem. I also wanted to give a shout out to our host, Lindsay here, because Salem Maritime has been engaged in a variety of initiatives which are expanding the African-American story in Salem, starting really in 2019. My colleague at Salem State, Bethany J., worked in collaboration with Salem Maritime. We have a wonderful prioritization of civic engagement at Salem State. And if we can find partners in the community, we can go to our dean, we can go to our provost and say, you know, can we offer up a course release for this faculty member to go work with this institution in the community? And so Bethany worked with Salem Maritime, along with Lindsay, our host here, when she was at the Peabody Museum. And that led to some wonderful walking tours that Salem Maritime still is offering, as well as Kabria and my colleague, another colleague of mine at Salem State, Liz Duclos-Arcello's great annotated guide to the sources of African-American history in Essex County. So that's another institution that is really expanding the way that we look at Salem and the way that we look at Salem history through this collaboration with Salem State. And I do want to give a shout out here because we shouldn't be so North Shore focused. The practice of public history is very strong in our state, in our Commonwealth, and all of the regional public universities are very have great faculty members who can assist you in any kind of local history project that you might be thinking about in your communities. So that brings us to my project. So here I am, you know, a tutor historian. What the hell do I know about Salem history? By the time that I started thinking about wanting to write something more formal, I had been blogging for about 10 years. And my blog, which is called Streets of Salem, and it keeps on going. I kind of wish I could stop it, but I just can't, because Salem offers something to write about every day, either good or bad. It's very inspirational. It's a very inspirational place to live, even though it drives me crazy on a regular basis. But I decided that with the help of my colleagues who are American historians, we could actually come up with a book that would focus on all of Salem's history, or as much of Salem's history as we possibly could. We were inspired by the work of my colleagues Dane Morrison and Nancy Schultz in the English department, who about 15 years ago published a great book on Salem called Salem, Myth, Place, and Memory. But their work was more of a cultural history, and we really wanted to just do a total history. I mean, complete. We used to use the word complete all the time when we're envisioning our project. So we decided to use, again, because this is going to be published for the quadricentennial, we just cleared all of our peer review, and the book is going into production. So we hope to have this out in just about a year. So it's available in the fall of 2025 for the beginning of the commemoration in 2026. And so as you can see, we've used a chronological format. And so in the first century, we're kind of looking at Salem from the perspective of geography and environmental history. We have a wonderful chapter that gives a whole context for Salem's so-called Indian deed, this deed that that exists in Salem and that has been on the wall of Salem City Hall for 2 centuries. And we're giving the whole context for that. We're also talking, here's a little bit of my English history here. We're also talking about these men and women who kind of went back and forth in the 17th century. There's a really interesting Atlantic culture that kind of existed. And so we've got that perspective in there. We have the only chapter that we have on the witch trials in the entire book is actually about Gallows Hill, which was verified to be the execution site of the accused witches about 8 years ago. So that whole process of verification by my colleague Tad Baker is our sole chapter on the Salem witch trials. In the 2nd century, from 1726 to 1826, we're really sort of going into Salem's kind of commercial heyday, and also the revolution, privateering. I have a chapter just solely on John Remond and his fight for citizenship throughout his long life. And we're talking about the abolitionist movement in Salem in that century as well. The 3rd chapter is all about Salem's Civil War experience, immigration, another feature of Salem's history that has not been studied. We have a few studies on the Polish community in Salem. We have some interesting studies on the French Canadian population in Salem. But that's about it. So labor history, industrial history, immigration history, these are all things that we're exploring in the 3rd and 4th centuries. We're also looking at, there's a kind of a unique moment in Salem's history, and I like to write about this a lot. It seems very obvious to me, so I hope I'm making my case, but it looks like in the 1890s, there's kind of a fight going on between, all of the architecture, maritime people, and all of the witchcraft entrepreneurs, a fight to see what identity Salem is going to take on. So we have some very interesting colonial revival culture going on at the same time where we have, Daniel Lowe selling his first witch spoon. So of course the witchcraft people won, but it looks kind of equal from the perspective of 1890, 1900. So I'm writing about that. The 4th chapter is all about the Great Salem Fire of 1914, very, very, very underrepresented in history. And then the experience of wars, the 1960s, the transition of our neighborhood called The Point, which was the industrial neighborhood that grew up around non-Pete Steve cotton company mills. It's transitioned from a French Canadian community to a largely Dominican community. Avi Chomsky is writing about that. And then we have 2 big chapters on tourism. Tourism has become, just a central part of our identity. So we have 1 chapter that's kind of from the perspective of tour guides in Salem, of which there are like 150, and another from the perspective of an oral history. My colleague Drew Darian conducted an oral history of witch trial descendants to just determine what they thought about Salem in the early 21st century. So we have 2 takes on tourism. So that's our book. We wish there's a lot of gaps still. We wanted to fill all the gaps, but we can't fill all the gaps. And so we did the best that we could, and we hope we have offered a complete story. I just wanted to kind of add one last point that goes back to my early slides about the uniqueness of Salem. You know, what we found in our book is that you would think like the American Revolution, the Civil War, you'd think everything has been written about that in Salem, but in fact, nothing has been written about that in Salem. So we had to, the hidden history in Salem is really kind of the traditional history, because the witch trials is so in the center of everything. So, you know, our book includes the, you know, first kind of full chapter about Salem's experience in the Revolution, which is very important. I mean, Salem, at this time of year, 250 years ago, Salem became the provincial capital, and a lot of things were playing out in the summer of 1774. That's been written about, you know, in journal articles, but never, you know, in a book like ours. Same thing with the Civil War. Same thing with World War I and World War II. So we had to do the really traditional history in collaboration with some of the more marginalized, we had to do marginalized events in collaboration with marginalized voices. And I hope in doing so, we have written a more complete history of Salem. So thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions and comments afterwards.
Great. Thank you, Donna, so much for that. I always love learning about Salem, especially anything related to the Polish history. My family is Polish. My brother and sister-in-law live right near the PLAV, the Polish Legion of American Vets in Salem. So we are fully ensconced in that neighborhood and everything. So now turning it over to our next speaker, Ken Turino, who is the manager of community partnerships at Historic New England and faculty at Tufts University Museum Studies Department. He is an author, consultant, and producer, and he frequently consults on interpretive planning and LGBTQ+ interpretation at historic sites such as the Frank Lloyd Wright's Fallingwater. His work includes publications like Gay is Good, commemorating LGBTQ history, and The Varied Telling of Queer History at Historic New England Sites. And his latest book, co-authored with Max van Valgui, is Reinventing the Historic House Museum, New Approaches and Proven Solutions. So welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Lindsay. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, I'm going to dive right into this because I'm conscious of our time frame. I really have to say I enjoyed hearing about the projects from our previous two speakers. I hope what I'm going to be talking about today will complement what they're talking about it. I'm working in the realm of public history as both of these projects intersected. What I want to do in my presentation is look at, I hope, as I said, to complement their presentations, I want to talk about some of the obstacles to interpreting queer history and what people are doing to overcome these. I also want to talk about some of the ways to interpret queer history, different techniques, different uses. I'm not going to talk about one project. I'm going to talk about many. I should also say that I am from the North Shore too, but I'm not going to concentrate on the North Shore. This is not a North Shore mafia by any means, folks. I hope to go a little broader. So let's talking about more what has been called difficult history or telling more complete stories. Let's look at what's happening nationally. And who would expect, but now organizations across the country are exploring these untold stories. One being Colonial Williamsburg. Who would have thunk? But they are. Lindsay in the introduction mentioned Fallingwater. Fallingwater, Frank Lloyd Wright's masterpiece. Everyone knows it, but do they know the queer stories behind it? No. So I was part of a team which included some of the thought leaders in interpreting queer history. Sue Ferrantino's, I'll show you her book later on, and Margaret Middleton, I'll show you her publications later on. We got together to talk about how we would tell the queer stories at falling water. The donor of the property, the son of the owner, Edward Kaufman, was queer, was gay, and it was his lover, his partner, that built their visitor center, which is now coming on 50 years old and can be nominated for the register. So this is a work in progress, and I'm trying to show that organizations are thinking about this in general. Historic New England owns 38 historic sites across New England, except for Vermont. And what we did for many years was tell the stories of dead rich white guys. Okay, maybe a few women thrown in there too, but that's essentially what we did. We didn't, as an organization, have the time or put the effort, I should say, into researching the untold stories. But that has changed under our former president, Carl Nold, and continuing now, where we are hiring historians to help us, the staff, learn about the stories we never had time to tell. So we're doing it. And put it in perspective, it's not just queer history. As our previous speakers have said, this is happening with all kinds of untold stories. Many of you know Monticello, but they're done avoiding Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings. And they're now interpreting her rooms, which were located in right below the main building, and telling the story of her relationship and children with Thomas Jefferson, which they did avoid. It took them 25 years to get around to doing this, but it's amazing what they're doing. Closer to home, some of you may have visited this wonderful, the Royal House Museum in Medford, Massachusetts, where you heard about the rum distiller who made lots of money. The 250 people or so that visited that house a year for the wonderful architecture heard that story, but that's all changed, including the name, which is now the Royal House and slave quarters, interpreting one of 3 or 4 remaining slave quarters, enslaved quarters in New England. And that's really exciting. And under their leadership of their director, they've really moved this house forward and connecting with the community, because it's all about connections with community. This is an award-winning house in Duxbury, Massachusetts, and I include it because although it was built by the captain, Bradford, he was held captive. And it's really the story of the women in the house. And this is not your typical house museum. You can view it on your own or on guided tour, and it's done with these displays that focus on the women who were involved, has Civil War nurses, and also with the abolitionist movement. To tell you about more inclusive stories, very few of us talk about stories with disability. Max von Bogle, my co-editor, and I did a workshop at this house in St. Louis. And what I really liked about it is they attempt in this room, which you see in this magnificent house, the story of Hazlitt Kyle Campbell, who was the last owner of this magnificent, huge house, but he shut himself up in this one room. And where the arrow is, this is a newspaper article that called him peculiar. And what it is talking about is mental illness. We don't talk about that. They do here, and there are more and more museums. 1 in 5, approximately 1 in 5 adults in the USA experience mental illness. And this is a story that's waiting to be told more. Many of you know one of the most popular history museums in all of America almost closed during COVID, and that is the Tenement Museum, which tells the story of working class immigrants. So telling these stories of the immigrants and so on. I'm involved. We will have a couple Salem stories. The House of Seven Gables in Salem, which was founded as a settlement house. And today, the settlement house was founded specifically to help new immigrants coming into Salem. And this neighborhood, Lindsay might know, Polish neighborhood. So they were one of the big groups of immigrants that were working, that were being taught crafts, work ethic, and at the Gables. Today, and I'm just stepped down as president last year, we still do that by having classes that deal with Naturalization, we also run ESL classes, so it goes right back to our founding mission. More and more museums are doing this. Now, I wanted to give you an example from other parts of the country. This La Casa Cordoba provides an example of how the narratives of exclusion were grounded in settler colonialism. This was the preservationists in this area who took this house away from the Cordova family, who had lived there since 1896, and they took it away in the 70s so they could tell the story of the white settlers. That has been changed, and now they had marginalized the owner, Maria Cordova, and her family, and that is now changed. This is owned by the Tucson Museum of Art, who is interpreting it now as the home of the Cordova family. Sites like the Eastern State Penitentiary are talking about sex in prison. We didn't do this in museums. We are, and this is about trans people, and it's an artist installation that you're seeing at the bottom. There was a warning when you go down this corridor that says, we're going to talk about some difficult history. But to me, it was really rewarding and filling in part of the story that wasn't told. So with queer history, LGBTQ history, what are some of the obstacles that we constantly hear from people at historic commissions, historic sites, museums? Well, there's a lack of documentary evidence, and there are our institutional policies against discussing this, pressure from stakeholders to avoid controversial topics, and applying modern labels to historic figures. The word gay or queer was not always used. That is changing. The Palmer Warner House, I've been fortunate to consult on, Connecticut landmarks, not 100% open to the public, but they didn't know until they looked that they had the documentary evidence about this couple. And I should mention their name, Robert Neal, preservationist who preserved the Goodspeed Opera House in the same town, East Haddam, on the right with his partner, Howard Metzger, who was a sailor, who he met at a bar in New York. We have all the documentary information, and we're working with the community to tell the story because everyone in the community knew they were gay and knew they were a couple, and they were very protective of that. So we're now working, I should say, they are now working with the community to open this house and tell the more complete story. And these are some of the things that they've been considering in the consulting that we've been doing and others have been doing about, what are the risks and benefits of telling these stories? Are we outing them? All questions to be considered. I can't give you an answer now, but we're coming to the conclusion, or Connecticut Landmarks is that no, we're not outing them. They were out to their community. Another good example of a site I've worked on, this site used to have a policy of if asked, will tell. This community of buildings in Wisconsin was saved by the couple, Robert Neal and Edgar Hilliam, who lived together in one of the houses and ran a restaurant. This is owned by the Wisconsin Historical Society. That policy of if asked, will tell, because people asked, well, were they a couple? They now acknowledge that. They've totally changed their interpretation to embrace and tell the more complete story. Now, several years ago, in England, the National Trust commemorated the 50th anniversary for the repeal of partial discrimination of homosexuality in England with events that took place at all of their properties that had queer stories. So it was an effort, and this is the publication, I love the cover, and unlocking the histories of some places in their care, many of which were home to and shaped by queer people who challenged wider society's conventional ideas of gender and sexuality. When I started doing this work, there was only a handful of sites that were attempting to talk about queer history. The Alice Austin House is one of those sites that was hesitant with their board and their staff to tell the story about her life. Alice Austin was a photographer and her partner, Gertrude Tate. And now they fully embraced and have worked with the queer community doing exhibitions and so on to embrace and tell more of this story. And it's getting broader. We heard in the first presentation about historical markers, a different form. They're popping up everywhere. I shouldn't say everywhere. They're popping up in these locations. Top two are in Philadelphia. I was standing in front of one and looked up in gay rights demonstrations. Others of these I visited as I've been doing my workshops around the country with Max, just to show you. And the National Historic Landmarks sites like the Stonewall have become National Historic Landmarks. This is all great to tell the story. Polly Murray has a connection with Massachusetts. She was denied access to Harvard, but her papers are at Radcliffe. She was a reformer. She was the first woman Episcopal minister. She was also asexual or bisexual. Her site opened during COVID here. You can see a National Historic Landmark. And they are working again to tell a more complete story. So how can you do this? How can you tell this history in your communities? Exhibitions. This was a landmark exhibition in Chicago. I couldn't, at one point, I could count on my two hands the number of exhibitions that dealt with queer history 20 years ago. I can't even keep track of them now. Good publication on this. Got to see this. This was a community-based exhibition done at the Museum of History and Industry in Seattle, working with the queer community to co-curate this exhibition. For Stonewall, the New York Public Library. So exhibitions are one technique you can use. At Historic New England, we're not necessarily, but you'll hear in a minute, doing exhibitions that focus just on queer history, but trying to incorporate queer history into the regular exhibitions that we're doing. This one is on jewelry that we did at our Eustis estate, and these were commitment rings before marriage was legal of two gentlemen that are in our collection. So making sure, just in our regular exhibitions, that we're including other stories and history. This was another one that dealt with hats and shoes, head to toe, and disco boots from P-Town, both sets of boots from a donor to incorporate that in and tell some of the queer history. I mentioned that the National Trust in England had done a full year of interpreting queer history, but doesn't go away. As part of that, they did artists in residence and did temporary exhibitions. So artists in residence are a good team. Sissinghurst is the site of Victoria Sackveld West. I've had the pleasure of visiting this, and they talk about the complicated story of her and her bisexuality and her husband's bisexuality. So more and more sites are doing that. The Museum of History and Industry in Seattle, not just doing temporary exhibitions, and I know I have to wrap up soon, so I'm going to go very quickly, have incorporated these stories into their regular exhibitions, not just their temporary. Same with Rosie the Riveter, talking about queer stories. Gibson House Museum is an example of a site that, because there were descendants on the board for many years, they did not want the story told about Charlie Gibson in Boston being a queer man. Well, they started slowly. They did an exhibition with Hannah Barrett, pictured here, of interpreting this queer history, and now regularly offer pride tours. Beauport, Historic New England's property, may have been the first property in the country to openly interpret this as the home of a gay man. And this is Henry Davis Sleeper, you can see here. And as part of that, we've partnered at Historic New England for over a decade with Boston's LGBTQ Historical Society, the History Project, to tell these stories of this magnificent house on Gloucester Harbor. And his group, including Isabel Stewart Gardner there in the front, the first curator on the left of Asian art at the MFA, and so on. So we've been doing events for over a decade, which include neighborhood walking tours because it was a queer community out there. We've been doing lectures, pride tours. So tours are another way. I love this sign. it was an ad for Chase and Sanborn of these well-known bachelors, and it includes Sleeper, who was an interior decorator and well-known, but also includes Gary Cooper, who we now know of his bisexual proclivity. This is Trip Evans, who you'll hear about in a second, doing a lecture on this. Again, partnering with the History Project to do special tours and programs and receptions. People can just kick back, have a good time at the beautiful grounds. And we've reinterpreted Sarah Orne Jewett at Historic New England to tell more the story of the loving relationship between Annie Adams Field on the left and author Sarah Orne Jewett. This is Annie Field's bedroom. And if you look at it, this is the view from the bed. The last thing she sees at night is an image on the fireplace of her partner, Annie Fields. And if you see the mirror to the left of the bed, the first thing she sees in the morning, the mirror is positioned so that she's looking at an image of Annie Fields. These objects tell stories. So we've been offering with the History Project over the years, not currently, a Beacon Hill walking tour. As part of that exhibition at the Museum of History and Industry in Seattle, this was another walking tour, a good technique to tell these stories. And Longfellow House, there's an article calling it the queerest house in Cambridge. Longfellow House in Washington's headquarters has really made a concerted effort and great effort with specialty themed tours to tell the story of Harry, Dana, and Alice Longfellow and their relationships with sexuality in the 20th century. And I'm going to invite you all to our newest exhibition called The Importance of Being Furnished for Bachelors at Home, which features some of the men you've already heard about, like Henry Davis Sleeper, and others you haven't, like Charles Pendleton, whose recreated home is part of the RISD Museum to house their decorative arts collection, Ogden Codman, and Henry Davis Sleeper you see there. This is opening, go back here, June 21st. So please come and see. There will be books, public programs, looking at the lives of these four queer men and their work with design. So for resources, Sue Ferrantino's landmark book, which I think Sue's going to be revising soon. Public Historian has a whole issue dedicated to queering public history. This is available online, a great, great resource, LGBTQ America from the National Park Service. The Inclusive Historian's Handbook, free, and has a section on interpreting that. And lastly, Margaret Middleton's The Queer Possibility in the Museum. So that is available for free download online. So with that, our book is always a good resource. I'm going to stop and turn it back to Lindsay.
That was wonderful, Ken. Thank you. Learned so much. And many of those places I do love. I do love Beauport. I go there frequently. I bring everyone who comes to visit me to that house museum. It is my favorite, with the 1600s room and all the amber glass and everything. I love it. And I just want to say thank you to all our speakers for sharing their expertise with us. And so to everyone who is still on the line, if you have any questions for any of our speakers, please put them in the chat. But if you can be sure to maybe denote which speaker you are asking the question for, that would be incredibly helpful to me. And everything. So I really appreciate Kabria, Donna, and Ken. We're getting a lot of thank yous. Maybe Ken, sorry, we do have one from Sarah. This is for Dr. Baumgartner. She couldn't read the text in your image of the signs, but I'm wondering whether the text offers the public any information about the scholarship that informed the stories being told. Is there any mention of some of the monographs, articles, or their authors, or perhaps a bibliography of any kind?
There is on the website, so I will put the website in the chat in a second. And We list there some of the sources we've used, especially those that are in the public domain. For our sign on Mary Prince, we relied a lot on her own narrative, on her own words, describing her experience in the 19th century. She was born in Newburyport, and lived in Boston. So I'll put that in the chat so you can take a look, and you can also read all of our signs on that website. So if you don't have a chance to come down to Newburyport, you can read our signs online.
And then we have one from Cicely. Does anyone know, and so maybe this is open to all three of you, does anyone know of public historians interested in interpreting plants, gardens, agriculture to illuminate cultural history in the last 250 years? Because yes, I think, you know, that is part of our cultural history. And, you know, as we know, everyone is a part of that, so.
There's a great book. It's Lucinda Newburyport. It's Lucinda Brockway, I believe. Yeah, that I love that book. It's about early federal gardens.
So I'm going to recommend you look at the Olana, which is in upstate New York by Hudson. Look at their website. Sean Sawyer is the president. You should look at what they're doing because they have been totally focusing in on the landscape. That's Frederick Edward Church's masterpiece of a Moorish fantasy, but the focus is on landscape. And Sean has been a real leader in the field and spoken on that. He's away right now, but if you look at the site, I think that might be a good way to go. And Sean Sawyer can certainly give you others. There's been a real focus, and we talk about this in my historic house class, on, you know, in historic New England too. We didn't talk about the landscape. And I would really look at what other sites are doing for inspiration. There's been a lot of great work. I should say the trustees too, in Massachusetts are another great resource. There's a great chapter by Lucinda Brockway in Max in My Book. So it's based on the National Trust in Britain's model of looking at their site, including landscape. So there's some good resources.
And I will say we will be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered, and we'll be putting some of these links that have been shared in the chat or mentioned in the talks and everything. I just kind of reading. Maybe a quick sort of, if all three of you would like to maybe say some words for this next question. It's from Roberta, and it's about ideas for finding collaborators or reaching out to public historians to help your community sort of flesh out its history. Like, so especially if you're on a historic commission, how can you outreach to, you know, maybe some academics and everything to help really sort of beef up the history that you're telling and everything? Do you have any thoughts, tips, tricks that people should be thinking of as they do this?
Well, I don't want to tread on Ken's terrain. I know he teaches at Tufts, but but our archivist lives in Somerville, our Salem State archivist, and one of my colleagues lives in Malden. So we're happy to talk to you. I put my email in at the beginning of my my presentation. But again, I really think that we're privileged in Massachusetts with the public history practitioners that are here. And I think any institution is going to want to work with you. It's good for our students. It's good for us. Public history is very strong in this state, very strong.
And I would look at being in Medford. You know, we have an internship program, and interns, which now the world is changing, interns should be paid. So that's something to be considered. And we've gone that way at Tufts, as many universities have, but Tufts has a museum studies program. We're always looking for internships, and it can be project-based. And even if you're on a commission, you don't have a site, we can still place students with you. And I think other universities, as you just said, Donna, we're so lucky with UMass, and other, and I'm a graduate of Salem State, so I'm a big fan. There are a lot of great public history programs out there. I would look at them. They require that the student have a supervisor, so you have to be able to commit that time to do that. But I think that's a tremendous resource.
Yeah, I would just echo that as well. I'm the former director of a public history program at Northeastern University. And so a lot of the work and projects that I do as a public historian are in collaboration with our undergraduate and graduate students who are very interested in public history. To Donna's point, I've just been so enthused by how passionate our students are about public history. They really want to do this work. And so that might be one way of collaborating, looking at some of the graduate programs in public history in the state and contacting the director there and seeing if there might be a student who's interested in working on the project. And I'm sometimes, depending on universities right now, especially with budget cuts, but sometimes universities can help find funding to support the student on your project. So I've been able
that's right.
to work with, I've been able to work with a couple of organizations that way. And I use research funds to fund the student because it's about their experience and it's about their education.
Great, thank you. We have one last question. This is from Barbara, who I actually know. So hi, Barbara. Do anyone have recommendations on books or resources that deal with Black or African-American history in Dorchester that you would like to recommend? I know that is a wide expanse and everything, or for the region. I know disowning slavery, Joan Pope's Mellish book has been mentioned. Are there anything else that people would like to recommend?
I mean, I think there are so many. So it depends on if we're thinking colonial, revolutionary, right? Moving then into the 19th or 20th century. If you're thinking about the Boston busing crisis, a great book is Ed Miletsky's book, Before, I think it's called Before Busing. There's also a great overview of the African-American community in New England by the Hortons. There's Hillary Moss's book, Schooling Citizens. I mean, it depends on the topic,
She says it's colonial.
Oh, colonial. Okay, so one of the great books that I've liked, it's an older book, more of a classic. There certainly are a couple of things one could change about it, but it's Lorenzo Green's book. I think it's called African Americans or Black People or Blacks in Colonial New England. Disowning Slavery covers a little bit of that colonial period. I will say that generally there is less scholarship on Black history in the colonial era. So that's sort of a bit of a gap in the field. We tend to sort of look at late 18th and 19th century. So there are more books to be written about colonial Black history.
Excellent. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to do a quick pitch, and then we will wrap up today's webinar.
Thanks very much. This was fascinating. And it reminded me that these great presentations reminded me that I should let everyone know that the statewide Historic Preservation Conference is scheduled to happen this year in person, live and in person at the Hanover Theater in Worcester on Friday, September 27th. And I put in the chat a link to a call for sessions for that conference. They're due June 1st, but I think we'll probably be extending that a bit. So if you're interested and know of a topic, please feel free to log into our website and check out that link and either send your ideas or send your proposal for a session. And we're really looking forward to having a live, interactive, in-person meeting this year where we can actually see each other for the first time in a few years in some cases. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you, Jeff, for sharing that. And thank you again to Kabria, Donna, and Ken for joining us and sharing your expertise with us. And thank you to everyone who joined either live or who will be watching the recording later as time permits. So thank you and have a wonderful Tuesday. So
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
bye.
you.
Bye.